Hello, Digra Italia. My name is Robert Horton. I'm speaking to you from the University of Winchester, specifically from the Centre of Medieval and Renaissance Research at the University of Winchester. Thanks very much for having me today. I'd like to begin with just giving a little bit of background information about myself. I work primarily on medieval Italy, most centrally working on the 10th, 11th and 12th centuries and addressing the Italian city-states, the Italian city communes in particular, but also looking at the investiture contest, this conflict between Pope and Emperor. However, I also do a lot of work involving video games. So I'm particularly interested in the ways in which games can be used as teaching implements, the ways they influence people's perceptions of the past, and most particularly at the moment, I'm interested in the ways in which games represent the Middle Ages, what sorts of tropes they bring with them. And I think this is fairly important because the Middle Ages have been used as inspirational material for more or less every single genre of computer game, running from role-playing games through first-person shooters, through to economic simulators, all the way through to grand strategy games. The Middle Ages provides a huge amount of source material for games set within the period, but also for fantasy games. And these games can be hugely influential on the way their players perceive the past. However, what's become apparent to me since I've started my work on computer games is that medieval Italy is very typically omitted or sidelined from representations of the Middle Ages within computer games. And what I'd like to address in this paper today is, where is medieval Italy? I'd like to talk about why medieval Italy gets abstracted to such a great extent and why it's very often omitted entirely from games addressing the Middle Ages. And in order to do this, I'm going to talk about 3 topics. I want to first of all start by making the case that representations of the Middle Ages within computer games are driven by a combination of 2 sets of tropes. So first of all, we need to consider the view of the Middle Ages in the popular imagination, these medievalist tropes, but alongside this we need to consider the tropes present within games as a whole. So the expectations that players have for video games, but also the restrictions of the computer games on the basis of their very nature, the particular nature of the media. So, having set this out, I'm then going to go on and talk about the ways in which medieval Italy is perceived within the popular imagination, or at least the way in which Italy is perceived within the Anglophone imagination. I'm going to make the case that this perception is very much at odds with the tropes typical to games set within the Middle Ages, that medieval Italy does not fit very neatly with the view of the Middle Ages presented within computer games. And finally, I'm going to very briefly talk about the ways in which medieval Italy does appear in games. I'll talk about the ways that Italy is often sidelined or made to look like just any other faction within Europe in the period. And then I'm going to briefly talk about some particular genres of game which have made deep and impressive use of medieval Italy for their source material or for their game mechanics. To start with though, I need to talk about the ways, the tropes present within games addressing the Middle Ages. So, as I've said, video games addressing the Middle Ages are subject to a set of crossbreed tropes. They're influenced by both popular perceptions of the Middle Ages, but also by the restrictions and the expectations of games as a medium. And to outline some of these typical medievalist tropes, well, we'll often see the Middle Ages presented as a violent period, but one that's epitomised by the roles of knights in shining armour, these hero figures. We'll also see the Middle Ages presented as a backwards, superstitious society, where the technological glories of Rome have been overcome by the filth of the Middle Ages. At the same time, we'll see the Middle Ages presented as predominantly religious, with the Catholic Church in particular playing a huge role within society and politics at every level. The Middle Ages will also typically be portrayed as one of overwhelming rural domination. Whenever the Middle Ages appear in fiction, they will typically be presented as this rural idyll ruled over by a king rather than any other figure. And finally, when the Middle Ages are represented in more or less any form of modern media, it will be presented as a period which is overwhelmingly white, more specifically Northern European, and more specifically still either English or Anglo-Saxon, or increasingly Viking. There's this very particular perspective of the Middle Ages, this very restrictive perspective of the Middle Ages present in modern Anglophone culture. Within games, though, this is combined with a number of other tropes from a very different tradition. So games typically, although with some notable exceptions, games typically focus on violence. There's various reasons for this, in part because this is something that's easy to abstract, it's easy to create, it's also what the players are expecting from the game. At the same time, though, games will very often focus on making this violence balanced, making it so that any participant within the game has an equal chance of success, just based purely on their skill. And again, this is something that ties in very neatly with the ideas of chivalry that we've talked about in relation to the popular perception of the Middle Ages. Computer games will very typically be designed to cater to a primarily white audience. The default player character will typically be white if you get a choice at all. See examples of this from the Mass Effect series. And the universe in which these games exist will typically be predominantly white, even if it's a very fantasy-based universe. Again, there's various reasons for this. A lot of it comes down to the perceived audience for these games. We also see games being traditionally afraid to tackle religious issues in any depth. So while games are perfectly happy to use religious imagery, religious architecture, even religious structures of power within their games, it's only very rarely that they'll address real-world religions in any real depth. It's incredibly rare for a game to allow you to play as a religious figure. So a forthcoming counterexample to this, a forthcoming exception rather to this, is the game Pope Simulator, due for release in the next couple of years, which could be very interesting, but also could be very terrifying. Games more typically shy away from representing religion to any great depth. And finally, games typically take a one-size-fits-all approach. So while games may offer the player a variety of characters, a variety of factions or nations, kingdoms to pick from, these kingdoms, these factions and so forth will very typically share the same core mechanics. They will be fundamentally the same, they'll just be palette swapped, or they'll have access to a few different units, a few different buildings, or what have you. And these two sets of tropes combine to present a very particular image of the Middle Ages within most computer games. And what we tend to see a focus on violence, but most particularly on heroic violence. Violence being led by knights, by being led by heroes, player characters. We also see a focus on white players and a white universe, building on the expectations of the audience of games, but also of expectations of the Middle Ages itself. Typically, we'll see the Middle Ages presented as a backwards period with frequent references to the glories of a forebear civilization, typically Rome if it's a game set in the real world, or any manner of predecessors for games set in fantasy realms which make use of medieval elements. And finally, we'll typically see references to religion, but these will be very tangential. They'll be background to the game itself. So while we'll see meticulous remodelling of cathedrals, we'll see use of religious imagery throughout games and throughout their lore, this will very typically be abstracted. The actual religion of the Middle Ages, Christianity in particular, will typically be sidelined. It won't be dealt with in any real depth. So, as I've outlined then, there are very particular images regarding the Middle Ages within modern games. And what I'm going to argue now is that medieval Italy does not fit these images. And this is the reason why Italy is only very rarely discussed in any depth within games addressing the Middle Ages. So when we think about Italy, we typically see a very different image from the popular perception of the Middle Ages. Medieval Italy is a land of cities. It's a very urban environment, in stark contrast to the predominantly rural image of the Middle Ages. These cities are typically ruled over, in the popular imagination at any rate, they're typically ruled over by merchants or artisans or bankers. The typical aristocracy, the nobles, and above all the king, are completely removed from the equation. Likewise, we don't typically see knights when we think about Italy in the Middle Ages, whether that's fair or not. And also, Italy is typically perceived to be a region of scientific and sociological development within the Middle Ages, where the rest of Europe is very much backwards and dirty and having lost all the glories of Rome. Italy, instead, is presented as very typically the one beacon of scientific advance. All of this sets Italy very much at odds with the representations of the Middle Ages typical within computer games. It makes it very hard to represent Italy within these environments. It's also important to underline the variety present within medieval Italy, because each individual Italian city, commune, is effectively an autonomous, if not outright independent power throughout much of the Middle Ages. It's much harder to represent Italy in any depth than it is any other region of Europe, where you can rely, in France, in Germany, in England, you can fall back to relying on a system of kingdoms, these single large powers which can be abstracted very neatly. Within Italy, you don't really have that same option if you're going to retain any semblance of the reality of the region. Instead, if you want to represent Italy, you have to represent each city individually. Likewise, we see a great deal of cultural, ethnic and racial variety within medieval Italy, particularly in the south, in what will become the Kingdom of Sicily. You have the Lombards, the Normans, the Byzantines, a large substantial Jewish population, and also Muslim Arabs and Berbers. But all of this multicultural, if you will, environment in the south of Italy does not lend itself well to the traditional perceptions of the Middle Ages. Italy and Sicily in particular stand in stark contrast to the typical representation of the Middle Ages in games. And finally, we need to consider the papacy. So if we talk about Italy in the Middle Ages, there are two key stereotypes, two key tropes that emerge. Firstly, the Italian city-states, city communes, and secondly, the papacy. But as I've said, even though religion is hugely important within the popular conception of the Middle Ages, it's very often sidelined within games, and the papacy is a particular example of this. Within all manner of strategy games, ranging from medieval Total War through to Crusader Kings, the Pope is important, but he's a non-player character. He's a set of mechanics that will impact the player in various different ways. You can't play as the Pope, and ultimately, Catholicism and Christianity in general is just another set of mechanics. It's not addressed in any great depth. So, for these various reasons, I think medieval Italy, or the popular conception of medieval Italy, does not fit well with the presentation of the Middle Ages in most video games. And this means a few things. It means that when Italy is represented in games, it tends to be in a handful of different ways. So first of all, we'll typically see Italy represented in a very abstract manner. Italy will often be represented as a kingdom, like any other in Europe. It will have the same base mechanics as any other region, any other kingdom. If you're lucky, the game will make some nods towards popular tropes about medieval Italy within its mechanics. So Italian kings will often gain a bonus to trade or income. They'll typically gain penalties to cavalry, to chivalry, to this sort of thing. If a game doesn't abstract Italy, it will very often marginalise Italy. So the example I've got here is from Crusader Kings 2, where we see a great deal of detail has been put into the recreation of Italy as a land of city-states. However, these city-states are predominantly unplayable. The mechanics exist, but you're not able to access them as the player. In effect, the region has been marginalised. In fact, the only places that we really see Italy being considered in any real depth in games which address the Middle Ages are within some very specific genres. And this is particularly true of city building games like Anno 1404 and trading simulators such as The Rise of Venice. So both of these games are built around themes which are very central to medieval Italy. It's an urban area and it's driven by trade and manufacture to a great extent. So Italy works very well for these specific genres. A final particular example of this, of a game that works very well in medieval Italy, is the second of the Assassin's Creed series. So this is set across the various cities, mainly of northern Italy, but going all the way down to Rome. And this works very well for this particular series of games because it provides an urban environment for the player character to conduct their free-running assassinations over. The disassociation of Italy from medieval chivalry makes it easier to present a player character as a hero who is essentially an assassin, who is a very pragmatic warrior who does not follow the code of chivalry to any extent whatsoever. And finally, the idea of Italy as a technological powerhouse within the Middle Ages works very well with the mechanics of the game. It allows the introduction of various weapons and tools which otherwise could not be explained within the Middle Ages. So Italy does exist within games. It is considered to some great depth within specific genres. It's just many genres, and the typical representation of the Middle Ages in games precludes Italy from receiving a particularly detailed treatment. So, to wrap everything up then, today I've talked about a few things. First of all, I've discussed medievalist and gaming tropes and made the case that games set in the Middle Ages rely on this combination of tropes to tell their stories. Secondly, I've talked about the tropes which apply to popular perceptions of Italy in the Middle Ages, and I've made the case that these tropes do not combine very well with the more typical tropes present within medieval games which address the Middle Ages. Finally, I've highlighted the ways in which games which do make use of Italy typically present Italy in an abstract fashion or marginalise the region. And I've highlighted the ways in which specialist niches make use of Italian games, so make use of Italy for their games. Genres such as city management simulators and trading simulators in particular. And the final point I'd like to raise, and what I'd really like to get into in the discussion following this session, so I'd like to think about the broader potential of medieval Italy in game design and as a setting within games. Because as we've seen with games such as The Witcher and Kingdom Come Deliverance, there is a substantial market for games which move beyond Western Europe as the only centre for inspiration. I think there's a lot of potential for Italy to be used in this manner, whether within RPGs, whether within strategy games, whether within more or less any genre of game. And that's something I'd be very interested in hearing everyone's opinions on and everyone's ideas about. So, thank you very much for having me, and I look forward to speaking to you all shortly.